Chapter 34 of The Quest of the Silver Fleece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Quest of the Silver Fleece by W.E.B. Du Bois. Chapter 34. The Return of Alwyn. Bles Alwyn stared at Mrs. Harry Cresswell in surprise. He had not seen her since that moment at the ball, and he was startled at the change. Her abundant hair was gone, her face was pale and drawn, and there were little wrinkles below her sunken eyes. In those eyes lurked the tired look of the bewildered and the disappointed. It was in the lofty waiting room of the Washington station where Alwyn had come to meet a friend. Mrs. Cresswell turned and recognized him with genuine pleasure. He seemed somehow a part of the few things in the world, little and unimportant perhaps, that counted and stood firm, and she shook his hand cordially, not minding the staring of the people about. He took her bag and carried it towards the gate, which made the observers breathe easier, seeing him in servile duty. Some way, she knew not just how, she found herself telling him of the crisis in her life before she realized. Not everything, of course, but a great deal. It was much as though she were talking to someone from another world, an outsider, but one she had known long, one who understood. Both from what she recounted and what she could not tell, he gathered the substance of the story, and it bewildered him. He had not thought that white people had such troubles. Yet, he reflected, why not? They, too, were human. "I suppose you hear from the school," he ventured after a pause. "Why, yes, not directly, but Zora used to speak of it." Bles looked up quickly. "Zora?" "Yes. Didn't you see her while she was here? She has gone back now." Then the gate opened, the crowd surged through, sweeping them apart, and next moment he was alone. Alwyn turned slowly away. He forgot the friend he was to meet. He forgot everything but the field of the Silver Fleece. It rose shadowy there in the pale concourse, swaying in ghostly breezes. The purple of its flowers mingled with the silver radiance of tendrils that trembled across the hurrying throng, like threads of mist along low hills. In its midst rose a dark, slim, and quivering form. She had been here in Washington. Why had he not known? What was she doing? She has gone back now, back to the sun and the swamp, back to the burden. Why should he not go back too? He walked on thinking. He had failed. His apparent success had been too sudden, too overwhelming. And when he faced the crisis, his hand had trembled. He had chosen the right, but the right was ineffective, impotent, almost ludicrous. It left him shorn, powerless, and in moral revolt. The world had suddenly left him, as the vision of Carrie Wynn had left him, alone, a mere clerk, an insignificant cog in the great grinding wheel of humdrum drudgery. His chance to do, and thereby to be, had not come. He thought of Zora again. Why not go back to the South where she had gone? He shuddered as one who sees before him a cold, black pool, whither his path leads. To face the proscription, the insult, the lawless hate of the South again? Never. And yet he went home and sat down and wrote a long letter to Miss Smith. The reply that came after some delay was almost curt. It answered few of his questions, argued with none of his doubts, and made no mention of Zora. Yes, there was need of a manager for the new farm and settlement. She was not sure whether Alwyn could do the work or not. The salary was meager and the work hard. If he wished it, he must decide immediately. 2 weeks later found Alwyn on the train facing southward in the Jim Crow car. How he had decided to go back south he did not know. In fact, he had not decided. He had sat helpless and inactive in the grip of great and shadowed hands, and the thing was as yet incomprehensible. And so it was that the vision Zora saw in the swamp had been real enough, and Alwyn felt strangely disappointed that she had given no sign of greeting on recognition. In other ways, too, Zora, when he met her, was to him a new creature. She came to him frankly and greeted him, her gladness shining in her eyes, yet looking nothing more than gladness and saying nothing more. Just what he had expected was hard to say, but he had left her on her knees in the dirt with outstretched hands, and somehow he had expected to return to some corresponding mental attitude. The physical change of these 3 years was marvelous. The girl was a woman, well rounded and poised, tall, straight, and quick. And with this went mental change, a self mastery, a veiling of the self even in intimate talk, a subtle air as of one looking from great and unreachable heights down on the dawn of the world. Perhaps no one who had not known the child and the girl as he had would have noted all this, but he saw and realized the transformation with a pang. Something had gone, the innocence and wonder of the child, and in their place had grown up something to him incomprehensible and occult. Miss Smith was not to be easily questioned on the subject. She took no hints and gave no information, and when once he hazarded some pointed questions, she turned on him abruptly, observing acidly, "If I were you, I'd think less of Zora and more of her work." Gradually, in his spiritual perplexity, Alwyn turned to Mary Cresswell. She was staying with the Colonel at Cresswell Oaks. Her coming South was supposed to be solely for reasons of health, and her appearance made this excuse plausible. She was lonely and restless, and naturally drawn toward the school. Her intercourse with Miss Smith was only formal, but her interest in Zora's work grew. Down in the swamp, at the edge of the cleared space, had risen a log cabin, long, low, spacious, overhung with oak and pine. It was Zora's center for her settlement work. There she lived, and with her a half a dozen orphan girls and children too young for the boarding department of the school. Mrs. Cresswell easily fell into the habit of walking by here each day, coming down the avenue of oaks, across the road, and into the swamp. She saw little of Zora personally, but she saw her girls and learned much of her plans. The rooms of the cottage were clean and light, supplied with books and pictures, simple toys, and a phonograph. The yard was one wide green and golden playground, and all day the music of children's glad crooning and the singing of girls went echoing and trembling through the trees as they played and sewed and washed and worked. From the Cresswells and the Maxwells and others came loads of clothes for washing and mending. The Tolliver girls had simple dresses made, embroidery was ordered from town, and soon there would be the gardens and cotton fields. Mrs. Cresswell would saunter down of mornings. Sometimes she would talk to the big girls and play with the children. Sometimes she would sit hidden in the forest, listening and glimpsing and thinking, till her head whirled and the world danced red before her eyes. Today she rose wearily, for it was near noon, and started home. She saw Alwyn swing along the road to the school dining room, where he had charge of the students at the noonday meal. Alwyn wanted Mrs. Cresswell's judgment and advice. He was growing doubtful of his own estimate of women. Evidently something about his standards was wrong. Consequently, he made opportunities to talk with Mrs. Cresswell when she was about, hoping she would bring up the subject of Zora of her own accord. But she did not. She was too full of her own cares and troubles, and she was only too glad of willing and sympathetic ears into which to pour her thoughts. Miss Smith soon began to look on these conversations with some uneasiness. Black men and white women cannot talk together casually in the South, and she did not know how far the North had put notions in Alwyn's head. Today both met each other almost eagerly. Mrs. Cresswell had just had a bit of news which only he would fully appreciate. "Have you heard of the Vanderpools?" she asked. "No, except that he was appointed and confirmed at last." "Well, they had only arrived in France when he died of apoplexy. I do not know," added Mrs. Cresswell. "I may be wrong, and I hope I'm not glad." Then there leaped into her mind a hypothetical question which had to do with her own curious situation. It was characteristic of her to brood and then restlessly to seek relief in consulting the one person near who knew her story. She started to open the subject again today. But Alwyn, his own mind full, spoke first and rapidly. He too had turned to her as he saw her come from Zora's home. He must know more about the girl. He could no longer endure this silence. Zora, beneath her apparent frankness, was impenetrable, and he felt that she carefully avoided him, although she did it so deftly that he felt rather than observed it. Miss Smith still systematically snubbed him when he broached the subject of Zora. With others he did not speak. The matter seemed too delicate and sacred, and he always had an awful dread lest sometime, somewhere, a fatal word would be dropped, a breath of evil gossip which would shatter all. He had hated to obtrude his troubles on Mrs. Cresswell, who seemed so torn in soul, but today he must speak, although time pressed. "Mrs. Cresswell," he began hurriedly, "there's a matter, a personal matter, of which I have wanted to speak a long time. The dinner bell rang, and he stopped, vexed. "Come up to the house this afternoon," she said. "Colonel Cresswell will be away." Then she paused abruptly. A strange, startling thought flashed through her brain. Alwyn noticed nothing. He thanked her cordially and hurried toward the dining hall, meeting Colonel Cresswell on horseback just as he turned into the school gate. Mary Cresswell walked slowly on, flushing and paling by turns. Could it be that this Negro had dared to misunderstand her, had presumed? She reviewed her conduct. Perhaps she had been indiscreet in thus making a confidant of him in her troubles. She had thought of him as a boy, an old student, a sort of confidential servant, but what had he thought? She remembered Miss Smith's warnings of years before, and he had been North since, acquired Northern notions of freedom and equality. She bit her lip cruelly. Yet, she mused, she was herself to blame. She had unwittingly made the intimacy, and he was but a Negro, looking on every white woman as a goddess and ready to fawn at the slightest encouragement. There had been no one else here to confide in. She could not tell Miss Smith her troubles, although she knew Miss Smith must suspect. Harry Cresswell apparently had written nothing home of their quarrel. All the neighbors behaved as if her excuse of ill health were sufficient to account for her return South to escape the rigors of a Northern winter. Alwyn, and Alwyn alone, really knew. Well, it was her blindness, and she must right it quietly and quickly, with hard, ruthless plainness. She blushed again at the shame of it. Then she began to excuse. After all, which was worse, a Cresswell or an Alwyn? It was no sin that Alwyn had done. It was simply ignorant presumption, and she must correct him firmly but gently, like a child. What a crazy muddle the world was! She thought of Harry Cresswell and the tale he told her in the swamp. She thought of the flitting ghosts that awful night in Washington. She thought of Miss Wynn, who had jilted Alwyn and given herself a very bad quarter of an hour. What a world it was, and after all, how far was this black boy wrong? Just then Colonel Cresswell rode up behind and greeted her. She started almost guiltily, and again A sense of the awkwardness of her position reddened her face and neck. The Colonel dismounted, despite her protest, and walked beside her. They chatted along indifferently, of the crops, her brother's new baby, the proposed mill. "Mary," his voice abruptly struck a new note, "I don't like the way you talk with that Alwyn nigger." She was silent. "Of course," he continued, "you're Northern born, and you have been a teacher in this school and feel differently from us in some ways. But mark what I say. A nigger will presume on the slightest pretext, and you must keep them in their place. Then, too, you are a Cresswell now." She smiled bitterly. He noticed it, but went on. "You are a Cresswell, even if you have caught Harry up to some of his deviltry." She started, and got miffed about it. "It'll all come out right. You're a Cresswell, and you must hold yourself too high to Mister a nigger, or let him dream of any sort of equality." He spoke pleasantly, but with a certain sharp insistence that struck a note of fear in Mary's heart. For a moment she thought of writing Alwyn not to call, but no, a note would be unwise. She and Colonel Cresswell lunched rather silently. "Well, I must get to town," he finally announced. "The mill directors meet today. If Maxwell calls by about that lumber, tell him I'll see him in town." And away he went. He had scarcely reached the highway and ridden a quarter of a mile or so when he spied Bles Alwyn hurrying across the field toward the Cresswell Oaks. He frowned and rode on. Then, reining in his horse, he stopped in the shadow of the trees and watched Alwyn. It was here that Zora saw him as she came up from her house. She, too, stopped, and soon saw whom he was watching. She had been planning to see Mr. Cresswell about the cut timber on her land. By legal right it was hers, but she knew he would claim half, treating her like a mere tenant. Seeing him watching Alwyn, she paused in the shadow and waited, fearing trouble. She, too, had felt that the continued conversations of Alwyn and Mrs. Cresswell were indiscreet, but she hoped that they had attracted no one else's attention. Now she feared the Colonel was suspicious, and her heart sank. Alwyn went straight toward the house and disappeared in the oak avenue. Still Colonel Cresswell waited, but Zora waited no longer. Alwyn must be warned. She must reach Cresswell's mansion before Cresswell did, and without him seeing her. This meant a long detour of the swamp to approach the Oaks from the west. She silently gathered up her skirts and walked quickly and carefully away. She was a strong woman, lithe and vigorous, living in the open air and used to walking. Once out of hearing, she threw away her hat and, bending forward, ran through the swamp. For a while she ran easily and swiftly. Then for a moment she grew dizzy, and it seemed as though she was standing still, and the swamp in solemn grandeur marching past, in solemn, mocking grandeur. She loosened her dress at the neck and flew on. She sped at last through the oaks, up the terraces, and slowing down to an unsteady walk, staggered into the house. No one would wonder at her being there. She came up now and then and sorted the linen and piled the baskets for the girls. She entered a side door and listened. The Colonel's voice sounded impatiently in the front hall. "Mary! Mary?" A pause, then an answer. "Yes, father." He started up the front stairway, and Zora hurried up the narrow back stairs, almost overturning a servant. "I'm after the clothes," she explained. She reached the back landing just in time to see Colonel Cresswell's head rising up the front staircase. With a quick bound she almost fell into the first room at the top of the stairs. Bles Alwyn hurried through his dinner duties and hastened to the Oaks. The questions, the doubts, the uncertainty within him were clamoring for utterance. How much had Mrs. Cresswell ever known of Zora? What kind of woman was Zora now? Mrs. Cresswell had seen her and had talked to her and watched her. What did she think? Thus he formulated his questions as he went, half timid and fearful in putting them, and yet determined to know. Mrs. Cresswell, waiting for him, was almost panic stricken. Probably he would beat round the bush seeking further encouragement, but at the slightest indication she must crush him ruthlessly and at the same time point the path of duty. He ought to marry some good girl, not Zora, but someone. Somehow Zora seemed too unusual and strange for him, too inhuman, as Mary Cresswell judged humanity. She glanced out from her seat on the upper veranda over the front porch and saw Alwyn coming. Where should she receive him? On the porch and have Mr. Maxwell ride up? In the parlor and have the servants astounded and talking? If she took him up to her own sitting room, the servants would think he was doing some work or fetching something for the school. She greeted him briefly and asked him in. "Good afternoon, Bles," using his first name to show him his place, and then inwardly recoiling at its note of familiarity. She preceded him upstairs to the sitting room, where, leaving the door ajar, she seated herself on the opposite side of the room and waited. He fidgeted, then spoke rapidly. "Mrs. Cresswell, this is a personal affair." She reddened angrily. "A love affair." She paled with something like fear. "And she started to speak but could not. "I want to know what you think about Zora." "About Zora?" she gasped weakly. The sudden reaction, the revulsion of her agitated feelings, left her breathless. "About Zora. You know I loved her dearly as a boy. How dearly I have only just begun to realize. I've been wondering if I understood, if I wasn't—" Mrs. Cresswell got angrily to her feet. "You have come here to speak to me of that," she choked, and Bles thought his worst fears realized. "Mary, Mary!" Colonel Cresswell's voice broke suddenly in upon them. With a start of fear, Mrs. Cresswell rushed out into the hall and closed the door. "Mary, has that Alwyn nigger been here this afternoon?" Mr. Cresswell was coming upstairs, carrying his riding whip. "Why, no," she answered, lying instinctively before she quite realized what her lie meant. She hesitated. "That is, I haven't seen him." I must have nodded over my book, and looking toward the little veranda at the front of the upper hall, where her easy chair stood with her book. Then, with an awful flash of enlightenment, she realized what her lie might mean, and her heart paused. Cresswell strode up. "I saw him come up. He must have entered. He's nowhere downstairs." He wavered and scowled. "Have you been in your sitting room?" And then, not waiting for a reply, he strode to the door. "But the damned scoundrel wouldn't dare—" He deliberately placed his hand in his right hand hip pocket and threw open the door. Mary Cresswell stood frozen. The full horror of the thing burst upon her. Her own silly misapprehension, the infatuation of Alwyn for Zora, her thoughtless, no, vindictive betrayal of him to something worse than death. She listened for the crack of doom. She heard a bird singing far down in the swamp. She heard the soft raising of a window and the closing of a door. And then, great God in heaven, must she live forever in this agony? And then she heard the door bang and Mr. Cresswell's gruff voice: "Well, where is he? He isn't in there." Mary Cresswell felt that something was giving way within. She swayed and would have crashed to the bottom of the staircase if just then she had not seen at the opposite end of the hall, near the back stairs, Zora and Alwyn emerge calmly from a room, carrying a basket full of clothes. Colonel Cresswell stared at them, and Zora instinctively put up her hand and fastened her dress at the throat. The Colonel scowled, for it was all clear to him now. "Look here," he angrily opened upon them. "If you niggers want to meet around, keep out of this house. Hereafter I'll send the clothes down. By God, if you want to make love, go to the swamp." He stamped down the stairs while an ashy paleness stole beneath the dark bronze of Zora's face. They walked silently down the road together, the old familiar road. Alwyn was staring moodily ahead. "We must get married before Christmas, Zora," he presently avowed, not looking at her. He felt the basket pause, and he glanced up. Her dark eyes were full upon him, and he saw something in their depth that brought him to himself and made him realize his blunder. "Zora," he stammered, "forgive me. Will you marry me?" She looked at him calmly, with infinite compassion, but her reply was uttered unhesitatingly, distinct, direct. "No, Bles." End of chapter 34. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Chapter 35 of The Quest of the Silver Fleece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Quest of the Silver Fleece by W. E. B. Du Bois. Chapter 35. The Cotton Mill. The people of Toomsville started in their beds and listened. A new song was rising on the air, a harsh, low, murmuring croon that shook the village ranged around its old square of dilapidated stores. It was not a song of joy, it was not a song of sorrow, it was not a song at all, perhaps, but a confused whizzing and murmuring, as of 1,000 ill-tuned, busy voices. Some of the listeners wondered, but most of the town cried joyfully, "It's the new cotton mill." John Taylor's head teemed with new schemes. The mill trust of the North was at last a fact. The small mills had not been able to buy cotton when it was low because Cresswell was cornering it in the name of the Farmers' League, and now that it was high they could not afford to, and many surrendered to the trust. "Next thing," wrote Taylor to Easterly, "is to reduce cost of production. Too much goes in wages. Gradually transfer mills south." Easterly argued that the labor was too unskilled in the South, and that to send Northern spinners down would spread labor troubles. Taylor replied briefly, "Never fear, we'll scare them with a vision of niggers in the mills." Colonel Cresswell was not so easily won over to the new scheme. In the first place, he was angry because the school, which he had come to regard as on its last legs, somehow still continued to flourish. The $10,000 mortgage had but 3 more years, and that would end all, but he had hoped for a crash even earlier. Instead of this, Miss Smith was cheerfully expanding the work, hiring new teachers, and especially she had brought to help her 2 young Negroes whom he suspected. Colonel Cresswell had prevented the Tolliver land sale only to be inveigled himself into Zora's scheme, which now began to worry him. He must evict Zora's tenants as soon as the crops were planted and harvested. There was nothing unjust about such a course, he argued, for Negroes, anyway, were too lazy and shiftless to buy the land. They would not, they could not, work without driving. All this he imparted to John Taylor, to which that gentleman listened carefully. "I see," he owned, "and I know the way out." "How?" "A cotton mill in Toomsville." "What's that got to do with it?" "Bring in whites." "But I don't want poor white trash. I'd sooner have niggers." "Now see here," argued Taylor, "you can't have everything you want. Days gone by for aristocracy of old kind. You must have neighbors? Choose, then, white or black. I say white." "But they'll rule us, outvote us, marry our daughters," warmly objected the Colonel. "Some of them may, most of them won't. A few of them with brains will help us rule the rest with money. We'll plant cotton mills beside the cotton fields, use whites to keep niggers in their place, and the fear of niggers to keep the poorer whites in theirs." The colonel looked thoughtful. "There's something in that," he confessed after a while, "but it's a mighty big experiment, and it may go awry. Not with brains and money to guide it. At any rate, we've got to try it. It's the next logical step, and we must take it. But in the meantime, I'm not going to give up the old methods. I'm going to set the sheriff behind these lazy niggers," said the colonel, "and I'm going to stop that school putting notions into their heads." In 3 short months the mill at Toomsville was open, and its wheels whizzing to the boundless pride of the citizens. "Our enterprise, sir," they said to the strangers on the strength of the $5,000 locally invested. Once it had vigor to sing, the song of the mill knew no resting. Morning and evening, day and night, it crooned its rhythmic tune. Only during the daylight Sundays did its murmur die to a sibilant hiss. All the week its doors were filled with the coming and going of men and women and children. Many men, more women, and greater throngs of children. It seemed to devour children, sitting with its myriad eyes gleaming, and its black maw open, drawing in the pale white mites, sucking their blood, and spewing them out paler and ever paler. The face of the town began to change, showing a ragged tuberculosis-looking side, with dingy homes in short and homely rows. There came gradually a new consciousness to the town. Hitherto town and country had been ruled by a few great landlords, but at the very first election Colton, an unknown outsider, had beaten the regular candidate for sheriff by such a majority that the big property owners dared not count him out. They had, however, an earnest consultation with John Taylor. "It's just as I said," growled Colonel Cresswell. "If you don't watch out, our whole plantation system will be ruined, and we will be governed by this white trash from the hills." "There's only one way," sighed Caldwell, the merchant. "We've got to vote the niggers." John Taylor laughed. "Nonsense." He spurned the suggestion. "You're old-fashioned. Let the mill hands have the offices. What good will it do?" "What good? Why, they'll do as they please with us." "Bosh! Don't we own the mill? Can't we keep wages where we like by threatening to bring in nigger labor?" "No, you can't permanently," Maxwell disputed, "for they sometime will call your bluff." "Let 'em call," said Taylor, "and we'll put niggers in the mills." "What?" ejaculated the landlords in chorus. Only Maxwell was silent. "And kill the plantation system?" "Oh, maybe sometime, of course, but not for years. Not until you've made your pile. You don't really expect to keep the darkies down forever, do you?" "No, I don't," Maxwell slowly admitted. "This system can't last always. Sometimes I think it can't last long. It's wrong through and through. It's built on ignorance, theft, and force, and I wish to God we had the courage enough to overthrow it and take the consequences. I wish it was possible to be a Southerner and a Christian and an honest man, to treat niggers and dagoes and white trash like men, and be big enough to say, 'To hell with consequences.'" Colonel Cresswell stared at his neighbor, speechless with bewilderment and outraged traditions. Such unbelievable heresy from a Northerner or a Negro would have been natural, but from a Southerner whose father had owned 500 slaves it was incredible. The other landlords scarcely listened. They were dogged and impatient, and they could suggest no remedy. They could only blame the mill for their troubles. John Taylor left the conference blithely. "No," he said to the committee from the new Mill Workers Union, "can't raise wages, gentlemen, and can't lessen hours. Mill is just started and not yet paying expenses. You're getting better wages than you ever got. If you don't want to work, quit. There are plenty of others, white and black, who want your jobs." The mention of black people as competitors for wages was like a red rag to a bull. The laborers got together, and at the next election they made a clean sweep. Judge, sheriff, 2 members of the legislature, and the registrars of votes. Undoubtedly the following year they would capture Harry Cresswell's seat in Congress. The result was curious. From two sides, from landlord and white laborer, came renewed oppression of black men. The laborers found that their political power gave them little economic advantage as long as the threatening cloud of Negro competition loomed ahead. There was some talk of a strike, but Colton, the new sheriff, discouraged it. "I tell you, boys, where the trouble lies, it's the niggers. They live on nothing and take any kind of treatment, and they keep wages down. If you strike, they'll get your jobs, sure. You'll just have to grin and bear it a while, but get back at the darkies whenever you can. I'll stick 'em into the chain gang every chance I get." On the other hand, inspired by fright, the grip of the landlords on the black serfs closed with steadily increasing firmness. They saw one class rising from beneath them to power, and they tightened the chains on the other. Matters simmered on this way, and the only party wholly satisfied with conditions was John Taylor and the few young Southerners who saw through his eyes. He was making money. The landlords, on the contrary, were losing power and prestige, and their farm labor, despite strenuous efforts, was drifting to town, attracted by new and incidental work and higher wages. The mill hands were more and more overworked and underpaid, and hated the Negroes for it, in accordance with their leaders' directions. At the same time, the oppressed blacks and scowling mill hands could not help recurring again and again to the same inarticulate thought which no one was brave enough to voice. Once, however, it came out flatly. It was when Zora, crowding into the village courthouse to see if she could not help Aunt Rachel's accused boy, found herself beside a gaunt, overworked white woman. The woman was struggling with a crippled child, and Zora, turning, lifted him carefully for the weak mother, who thanked her half timidly. "That mill's about killed him," she said. At this juncture the manacled boy was led into court, and the woman suddenly turned to Zora. "Darned if I don't think these white slaves and black slaves had ought to get together," she declared. "I think so too," Zora agreed. Colonel Cresswell himself caught the conversation, and it struck him with a certain dismay. Suppose such conjunction should come to pass. He edged over to John Taylor and spoke to him, but Taylor, who had just successfully stopped the suit for damages to the injured boy, merely shrugged his shoulders. "What's this nigger charged with?" demanded the judge when the first black boy was brought up before him. "Breaking his labor contract." "Any witnesses?" "I have the contract here," announced the sheriff. "He refuses to work." "A year or $100." Colonel Cresswell paid his fine and took him in charge. "What's the charge here?" said the judge, pointing to Aunt Rachel's boy. "Attempt to kill a white man." "Any witnesses?" "None except the victim." "And I," said Zora, coming forward. Both the sheriff and Colonel Cresswell stared at her. Of course, she was simply a black girl, but she was an educated woman, who knew things about the Cresswell plantations that it was unnecessary to air in court. The newly elected judge had not yet taken his seat, and Cresswell's word was still law in the court. He whispered to the judge. "Case postponed," said the court. The sheriff scowled. "Wait till Jim gets on the bench," he growled. The white bystanders, however, did not seem enthusiastic, and one man, he was a Northern spinner, spoke out plainly. "It's none of my business, of course. I've been fired, and I'm damn glad of it. But see here, if you mutts think you're going to beat these big blokes at their own game of cheating niggers, you're daffy. You take this from me. Get together with the niggers and hold up this whole capitalist gang. If you don't get the niggers first, they'll use 'em as a club to throw you down. You hear me?" And he departed for the train. Colton was suspicious. The sentiment of joining with the Negroes did not seem to arouse the bitter resentment he expected. There even came whispers to his ear that he had sold out to the landlords, and there was enough truth in the report to scare him. Thus to both parties came the uncomfortable specter of the black men, and both sides went to work to lay the ghost. Particularly was Colonel Cresswell stirred to action. He realized that in Bles and Zora he was dealing with a younger class of educated black folk, who were learning to fight with new weapons. They were, he was sure, as dissolute and weak as their parents, but they were shrewder and more aspiring. They must be crushed, and crushed quickly. To this end he had recourse to two sources of help, Johnson and the whites in town. Johnson was what Colonel Cresswell repeatedly called a faithful nigger. He was one of those constitutionally timid creatures in whom the servility of his fathers had sunk in so deep that it had become second nature. To him a white man was an archangel, while the Cresswells, his father's masters, stood for God. He served them with dog-like faith, asking no reward, and for what he gave in reverence to them he took back in contempt for his fellow niggers. He applied the epithet with more contempt than the colonel himself could express. To the negroes he was a white folk's nigger, to be despised and feared. To him Colonel Cresswell gave a few pregnant directions. Then he rode to town and told Taylor again of his fears of a labor movement which would include whites and blacks. Taylor could not see any great danger. Of course, he conceded, they'll eventually get together. Their interests are identical. I'll admit it's our game to delay this as long as possible. It must be delayed forever, sir. Can't be, was the terse response. But even if they do ally themselves, our way is easy. Separate the leaders, the talented, the pushers of both races from their masses, and through them rule the rest by money. But Colonel Cresswell shook his head. It's precisely these leaders of the Negroes that we must crush, he insisted. Taylor looked puzzled. I thought it was the lazy, shiftless, and criminal Negroes you feared. Hang it, no. We can deal with them. We've got whips, chain gangs, and mobs, if need be. No, it's the Negro who wants to climb up that we've got to beat to his knees. Taylor could not follow this reasoning. He believed in an aristocracy of talent alone, and secretly despised Colonel Cresswell's pretensions of birth. If a man had ability and push, Taylor was willing and anxious to open the way for him, even though he were black. The caste way of thinking in the South, both as applied to poor whites and to Negroes, he simply could not understand. The weak and the ignorant of all races he despised and had no patience with them, but others, a man's a man, isn't he? He persisted. But Colonel Cresswell replied, no, never if he's black, and not always when he's white, and he stalked away. Zora sensed fully the situation. She did not anticipate any immediate understanding with the laboring whites, but she knew that eventually it would be inevitable. Meantime the Negro must strengthen himself and bring to the alliance as much independent strength as possible. For the development of her plans she needed Bles Alwyn's constant cooperation. He was business manager of the school and was doing well, but she wanted to point out to him the larger field. So long as she was uncertain of his attitude toward her, it was difficult to act, but now, since the flash of the imminent tragedy at Cresswell Oaks had cleared the air, with all its hurt, a frank understanding had been made possible. The very next day Zora chose to show Bles over her new home and grounds, and to speak frankly to him. They looked at the land, examined the proposed farm sites, and viewed the living room and dormitory in the house. "You haven't seen my den," said Zora. "No." "Miss Smith is in there now. She often hides there. Come." He went into the large central house and into the living room, then out on the porch, beyond which lay the kitchen. But to the left and at the end of the porch was a small building. It was ceiled in dark yellow pine, with figured denim on the walls. A straight desk of rough hewn wood stood in the corner by the white curtained window, and a couch and two large easy chairs faced a tall, narrow fireplace of uneven stone. A thick green rag carpet covered the floor. A few pictures were on the walls: a Madonna, a scene of mad careering horses, and some sad baby faces. The room was a unity. Things fitted together as if they belonged together. It was restful and beautiful, from the cheerful pine blaze before which Miss Smith was sitting, to the square paned window that let in the crimson rays of gathering night. All around the room, stopping only at the fireplace, ran low shelves of the same yellow pine, filled with books and magazines. He scanned curiously Plato's Republic, Gorky's Comrades, a Cyclopedia of Agriculture, Balzac's novels, Spencer's First Principles, Tennyson's poems. "This is my university," Zora explained, smiling at his interested survey. They went out again and wandered down near the old lagoon. "Now, Bles," she began, "since we understand each other, can we not work together as good friends?" She spoke simply and frankly, without apparent effort, and talked on at length of her work and vision. Somehow he could not understand. His mental attitude toward Zora had always been one of guidance, guardianship, and instruction. He had been judging and weighing her from on high, looking down upon her with thoughts of uplift and development. Always he had been holding her dark little hands to lead her out of the swamp of life, and always, when in senseless anger he had half forgotten and deserted her, this vision of elder brotherhood had still remained. Now this attitude was being revolutionized. She was proposing to him a plan of wide scope, a bold regeneration of the land. It was a plan carefully studied out, long thought of and read about. He was asked to be co-worker, nay, in a sense to be a follower, for he was ignorant of much. He hesitated. Then all at once a sense of his utter unworthiness overwhelmed him. Who was he to stand and judge this unselfish woman? Who was he to falter when she called? A sense of his smallness and narrowness, of his priggish blindness, rose like a mockery in his soul. One thing alone held him back. He was not unwilling to be simply human, a learner and a follower, but would he, as such, ever command the love and respect of this new and inexplicable woman? Would not comradeship on the basis of the new friendship which she insisted on be the death of love and thoughts of love? Thus he hesitated, knowing that his duty lay clear. In her direst deed he had deserted her. He had left her to go to destruction, and expected that she would. By a superhuman miracle she had risen and seated herself above him. She was working. Here was work to be done. He was asked to help. He would help. If it killed his old and newborn dream of love, well and good. It was his punishment. Yet the sacrifice, the readjustment was hard. He grew to it gradually, inwardly revolting, feeling always a great longing to take this woman and make her nestle in his arms as she used to, catching himself again and again on the point of speaking to her and urging, yet ever again holding himself back and bowing in silent respect to the dignity of her life. Only now and then, when their eyes met suddenly and unthinkingly, a great kindling flash of flame seemed struggling behind showers of tears, until in a moment she smiled or spoke, and then the dropping veil left only the frank open glance, unwavering, soft, kind, but nothing more. Then Alwyn would go wearily away, vexed or disappointed or merely sad, and both would turn to their work again. End of chapter 35. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Chapter 36 of The Quest of the Silver Fleece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Quest of the Silver Fleece by W.E.B. Du Bois. Chapter 36. The Land. Colonel Cresswell started all the more grimly to overthrow the new work at the school, because somewhere down beneath his heart a pity and a wonder were stirring, a pity at the perfectly useless struggle to raise the unraisable, a wonder at certain signs of rising. But it was impossible and unthinkable, even if possible. So he squared his jaw and cheated Zora deliberately in the matter of the cut timber. He placed every obstacle in the way of getting tenants for the school land. Here Johnson, the faithful nigger, was of incalculable assistance. He was among the first to hear the call for prospective tenants. The meeting was in the big room of Zora's house, and Aunt Rachel came early with her cheery voice and smile, which faded so quickly to lines of sorrow and despair, and then twinkled back again. After her hobbled old Sykes. Fully a half hour later, Rob hurried in. Johnson, he informed the others, has sneaked over to Cresswell's to tell of this meeting. We ought to beat that nigger up. But Zora asked him about the new baby, and he was soon deep in child lore. Higgins and Sanders came together, dirty, apologetic, and furtive. Then came Johnson. "How do, Miss Zora? Mr. Alwyn, I sure is glad to see you, sir. Well, if there ain't Aunt Rachel, looking as young as ever. And Higgins, you scamp. Ah, Mr. Sanders. Well, gentlemen and ladies, this is sure going to be a good cotton season, I remember." And then he ran on endlessly. Now to this one, now to that, now to all, his little eyes all the while dancing insinuatingly here and there. About 9 o'clock a buggy drove up, and Carter and Simpson came in. Carter, a silent, strong-faced, brown laborer who listened and looked, and Simpson, a worried, nervous man who sat still with difficulty and commenced many sentences but did not finish them. Alwyn looked at his watch and at Zora, but she gave no sign until they heard a rollicking song outside, and Tyler burst into the room. He was nearly 7 feet high and broad-shouldered, yellow, with curling hair and laughing brown eyes. He was chewing an enormous quid of tobacco, the juice of which he distributed generously, and he had had just liquor enough to make him jolly. His entrance was a breeze and a roar. Alwyn then undertook to explain the land scheme. "It is the best land in the county." "When it's cleared," interrupted Johnson, and Simpson looked alarmed. "It is partially cleared," continued Alwyn, "and our plan is to sell off small 20-acre farms." "You can't do nothing on 20 acres," began Johnson, but Tyler laid his huge hand over his mouth and said briefly, "Shut up." Alwyn started again. "We shall sell a few 20-acre farms, but keep one central plantation of 100 acres for the school. Here Miss Zora will carry on her work, and the school will run a model farm with your help. We want to center here agencies to make life better. We want all sorts of industries. We want a little hospital with a resident physician and 2 or 3 nurses. We want a cooperative store for buying supplies. We want a cotton gin and sawmill, and in the future other things. This land here, as I have said, is the richest around. We want to keep this 100 acres for the public good and not sell it. We are going to deed it to a board of trustees, and those trustees are to be chosen from the ones who buy the small farms." "Who's going to get what's made on this land?" asked Sanders. "All of us. It's going first to pay for the land, then to support the home and the school, and then to furnish capital for industries." Johnson sniggered. "You mean you're going to live off of it?" "Yes," answered Alwyn. but I'm going to work for it." "Who's going—" began Simpson, but he stopped helplessly. "Who's going to tend this land?" asked the practical Carter. "All of us. Each man is going to promise us so many days' work a year, and we're going to ask others to help. The women and girls and school children. They will all help." "Can you put trust in that sort of help?" "We can when once the community learns that it pays." "Does you own the land?" asked Johnson suddenly. "No, we're buying it, and it's part paid for already." The discussion became general. Zora moved about among the men, whispering and explaining, while Johnson moved too, objecting and hinting. At last he arose. "Brethren," he began, "the plan's good enough for talking, but you can't work it. Who ever heerd tell of such a thing? First place, the land ain't yours. Second place, you can't get it worked. Third place, white folks won't allow it. Who ever heerd of such working land on shares?" "You do it for white folks each day. Why not for yourselves?" Alwyn pointed out. "'Cause we ain't white, and we can't do nothing like that." Tyler was asleep and snoring, and the others looked doubtfully at each other. It was a proposal a little too daring for them, a bit too far beyond their experience. One consideration alone kept them from shrinking away, and that was Zora's influence. Not a man was there whom she had not helped and encouraged, nor who had not perfect faith in her impetuous hope, her deep enthusiasm, and her strong will. Even her defects, the hard held temper, the deeply rooted dislikes, caught their imagination. Finally, after several other meetings, 5 men took courage, 3 of the best and 2 of the weakest. During the spring, long negotiations were entered into by Miss Smith to buy the 5 men. Colonel Cresswell and Mr. Tolliver had them all charged with large sums of indebtedness, and these sums had to be assumed by the school. As Colonel Cresswell counted over $2,000 of school notes and deposited them beside the mortgage, he smiled grimly, for he saw the end. Yet even then his hand trembled, and that curious doubt came creeping back. He put it aside angrily and glanced up. "Nigger wants to talk with you," announced his clerk. The colonel sauntered out and found Bles Alwyn waiting. "Colonel Cresswell," he said, "I have charge of the buying for the school and our tenants this year, and I naturally want to do the best possible. I thought I'd come over and see about getting my supplies at your store." "That's all right. You can get anything you want," said Colonel Cresswell cheerily, for this, to his mind, was evidence of sense on the part of the Negroes. Bles showed his list of needed supplies: seeds, meat, cornmeal, coffee, sugar, etc. The colonel glanced over it carelessly and then moved away. "All right, come and get what you want any time," he called back. "But about the prices?" said Alwyn, following him. "Oh, they'll be all right." "Of course, but what I want is an estimate of your lowest cash prices." "Cash?" "Yes, sir." Cresswell thought a while. Such a businesslike proposition from Negroes surprised him. "Well, I'll let you know," he said. It was nearly a week later before Alwyn approached him again. "Now see here," said Colonel Cresswell, "there's practically no difference between cash and time prices. We buy our stock on time, and you can just as well take advantage of this as not. I have figured out about what these things will cost. The best thing for you to do is to make a deposit here and get things when you want them. If you make a good deposit, I'll throw off 10%, which is all of my profit." "Thank you," said Alwyn, but he looked over the account and found the whole bill at least twice as large as he had expected. Without further parley, he made some excuse and started to town, while Mr. Cresswell went to the telephone. In town, Alwyn went to all the chief merchants one after another, and received, to his great surprise, practically the same estimate. He could not understand it. He had estimated the current market prices according to the Montgomery paper, yet the prices in Toomsville were 50 to 150% higher. The merchant to whom he went last laughed. "Don't you know we're not going to interfere with Colonel Cresswell's tenants?" He stated the dealer's attitude, and Alwyn saw light. He went home and told Zora, and she listened without surprise. "Now to business," she said briskly. "Miss Smith," turning to the teacher, "as I told you, they're combining against us in town, and we must buy in Montgomery. I was sure it was coming, but I wanted to give Colonel Cresswell every chance. Bles starts for Montgomery." Alwyn looked up. "Does he?" he asked, smiling. "Yes," said Zora, smiling in return. "We must lose no further time." "But there's no train from Toomsville tonight." "But there's one from Barton in the morning, and Barton is only 20 miles away." "It is a long walk." Alwyn thought a while silently. Then he rose. "I'm going," he said. "Good bye." In less than a week the storehouse was full and the tenants were at work. The 20 acres of cleared swamp land, attended to by voluntary labor of all the tenants, was soon bearing a magnificent crop. Colonel Cresswell inspected all the crops daily with a proprietary air that would have been natural had these folks been simply tenants, and as such he persisted in regarding them. The cotton now growing was perhaps not so uniformly fine as the first acre of Silver Fleece, but it was of unusual height and thickness. "At least a bale to the acre," Alwyn estimated, and the Colonel mentally determined to take 2/3 of the crop. After that he decided that he would evict Zora immediately, since sufficient land was cleared already for his purposes, and moreover he had seen with consternation a herd of cattle grazing in one field on some early green stuff, and he heard a drove of hogs in the swamp. Such an example before the tenants of the Black Belt would be fatal. He must wait a few weeks for them to pick the cotton, then the end. He was fighting the battle of his color and caste. The children sang merrily in the brown-white field. The wide baskets poised aloft foamed on the erect and swaying bodies of the dark carriers. The crop throughout the land was short that year, for prices had ruled low last season in accordance with the policy of the combine. This year they started high again. Would they fall? Many thought so and hastened to sell. Zora and Alwyn gathered their tenants' crops, ginned them at the Cresswell gin, and carried their cotton to town, where it was deposited in the warehouse of the Farmers' League. "Now," said Alwyn, "we would best sell while prices are high." Zora laughed at him frankly. "We can't," she said. "Don't you know that Colonel Cresswell will attach our cotton for rent as soon as it touches the warehouse?" "But it's ours." "Nothing is ours. No black man ordinarily can sell his crop without a white creditor's consent." Alwyn fumed. "The best way," he declared, "is to go to Montgomery and get a first-class lawyer and just fight the thing through. The land is legally ours, and he has no right to our cotton." "Yes, but you must remember that no man like Colonel Cresswell regards a business bargain with a colored man as binding. No white man under ordinary circumstances will help enforce such a bargain against prevailing public opinion." "But if we cannot trust the justice of the case, and if you knew we couldn't, why did you try?" "Because I had to try, and moreover the circumstances are not altogether ordinary. The men in power in Toomsville are not the landlords of this county. They are poor whites. The judge and the sheriff were both elected by mill hands who hate Cresswell and Taylor. Then there's a new young lawyer who wants Harry Cresswell's seat in Congress. He don't know much law, I'm afraid, but what he don't know of this case, I think I do. I'll get his advice, and then I mean to conduct the case myself," Zora calmly concluded. Without a lawyer? Bles Alwyn stared in amazement. Without a lawyer in court. Zora, that would be foolish. Is it? Let's think. For over a year now I have been studying the law of the case, and she pointed to her law books. I know the law and most of the decisions. Moreover, as a black woman fighting a hopeless battle with landlords, I'll gain the one thing lacking. What's that? The sympathy of the court and the bystanders. Pshaw! From these Southerners? Yes, from them. They are very human, these men, especially the laborers. Their prejudices are cruel enough, but there are joints in their armor. They are used to seeing us either scared or blindly angry, and they understand how to handle us then. But at other times it is hard for them to do anything but meet us in a human way. But Zora, think of the contact of the court, the humiliation, the coarse talk. Zora put up her hand and lightly touched his arm. Looking at him, she said, "Mud doesn't hurt much. This is my duty. Let me do it." His eyes fell before the shadow of a deeper rebuke. He arose heavily. "Very well," he acquiesced as he passed slowly out. The young lawyer started to refuse to touch the case until he saw, or did Zora adroitly make him see, a chance for eventual political capital. They went over the matter carefully, and the lawyer acquired a respect for the young woman's knowledge. First, he said, get an injunction on the cotton, then go to court, and to ensure the matter he slipped over and saw the judge. Colonel Cresswell next day stalked angrily into his lawyer's office. "See here," he thundered, handing the lawyer the notice of the injunction. "See the judge," began the lawyer, and then remembered, as he was often forced to do these days, who was judge. He inquired carefully into the case and examined the papers. Then he said, "Colonel Cresswell, who drew this contract of sale?" "The black girl did." "Impossible." "She certainly did. Wrote it in my presence." "Well, it's mighty well done." "You mean it will stand in law?" "It certainly will. There's but one way to break it, and that's to allege misunderstanding on your part." Cresswell winced. It was not pleasant to go into open court and acknowledge himself overreached by a Negro, but several $1,000s in cotton and land were at stake. "Go ahead," he concurred. "You can depend on Taylor, of course," added the lawyer. "Of course," answered Cresswell. "But why prolong the thing?" "You see, she's got your cotton tied by injunction." "I don't see how she did it." "Easy enough. This judge is the poor white you opposed in the last primary." Within a week the case was called, and they filed into the courtroom. Cresswell's lawyer saw only this black woman. No other lawyer or sign of one appeared to represent her. The place was soon filled with a lazy, tobacco-chewing throng of white men. A few blacks whispered in one corner. The dirty stove was glowing with pine wood, and the judge sat at a desk. "Where's your lawyer?" he asked sharply of Zora. "I have none," returned Zora, rising. There came a silence in the court. Her voice was low, and the men leaned forward to listen. The judge felt impelled to be over gruff. "Get a lawyer," he ordered. "Your Honor, my case is simple, and with your Honor's permission I wish to conduct it myself. I cannot afford a lawyer, and I do not think I need one." Cresswell's lawyer smiled and leaned back. It was going to be easier than he supposed. Evidently the woman believed she had no case and was weakening. The trial proceeded, and Zora stated her contention. She told how long her mother and grandmother had served the Cresswells, and showed her receipt for rent paid. "A friend sent me some money. I went to Mr. Cresswell and asked him to sell me 200 acres of land. He consented to do so, and signed this contract in the presence of his son-in-law." Just then John Taylor came into the court, and Cresswell beckoned to him. "I want you to help me out, John." "All right," whispered Taylor. "What can I do?" "Swear that Cresswell didn't mean to sign this," said the lawyer quickly, as he arose to address the court. Taylor looked at the paper blankly and then at Cresswell, and some inkling of the irreconcilable difference in the two natures leaped into both their hearts. Cresswell might gamble and drink and lie like a gentleman, but he would never willingly cheat or take advantage of a white man's financial necessities. Taylor, on the other hand, had a horror of a lie, never drank nor played games of chance, but his whole life was speculation, and in the business game he was utterly ruthless and respected no one. Such men could never thoroughly understand each other. To Cresswell, a man who had cheated the whole South out of millions by a series of misrepresentations, ought to regard this little falsehood as nothing. Meantime, Colonel Cresswell's lawyer was on his feet, and he adopted his most irritating and contemptuous manner. This nigger wench wrote out some illegible stuff, and Colonel Cresswell signed it to get rid of her. We are not going to question the legality of the form. That is neither here nor there. The point is, Mr. Cresswell never intended, never dreamed of selling this wench land right in front of his door. He meant to rent her the land and sign a receipt for rent paid in advance. I will not worry your honor by a long argument to prove this, but just call one of the witnesses well known to you, Mr. John Taylor of the Toomsville Mills. Taylor looked toward the door and then slowly took the stand. "Mr. Taylor," said the lawyer carelessly, "were you present at this transaction?" "Yes." "Did you see Colonel Cresswell sign this paper?" "Yes." "Well, did he intend, so far as you know, to sign such a paper?" "I do not know his intentions." "Did he say he meant to sign such a contract?" Taylor hesitated. "Yes," he finally answered. Colonel Cresswell looked up in amazement, and the lawyer dropped his glasses. I don't think you perhaps understood me, Mr. Taylor," he gasped. "I meant to ask if Colonel Cresswell, in signing this paper, meant to sign a contract to sell this wench 200 acres of land." "He said he did," reiterated Taylor, "although I ought to add that he did not think the girl would ever be able to pay. If he had thought she would pay, I don't think he would have signed the paper." Colonel Cresswell went red, then pale, and leaning forward before the whole court, he hurled, "You damned scoundrel!" The judge rapped for order and fidgeted in his seat. There was some confusion and snickering in the courtroom. Finally, the judge plucked up courage. "The defendant is ordered to deliver this cotton to Zora Cresswell," he directed. The raging of Colonel Cresswell's anger now turned against John Taylor as well as the Negroes. Wind of the estrangement flew over town quickly. The poor whites saw a chance to win Taylor's influence, and the sheriff approached him cautiously. Taylor paid him slight courtesy. He was irritated with this devilish Negro problem. He was making money, his wife and babies were enjoying life, and here was this fool trial to upset matters. But the sheriff talked. "The thing I'm afraid of," he said, "is that Cresswell and his gang will swing in the niggers on us." "How do you mean?" "Let 'em vote." "But they have to read and write." "Sure." "Well, then," said Taylor, "it might be a good thing." Colton eyed him suspiciously. "You'd let a nigger vote?" "Why, yes, if he had sense enough." "There ain't no niggers got sense." "Oh, pshaw!" Taylor ejaculated, walking away. The sheriff was angry and mistrustful. He believed he had discovered a deep-laid scheme of the aristocrats to cultivate friendliness between whites and blacks, and then use black voters to crush the whites. Such a course was, in Colton's mind, dangerous, monstrous, and unnatural. It must be stopped at all hazards. He began to whisper among his friends. One or two meetings were held, and the flame of racial prejudice was studiously fanned. The atmosphere of the town and country quickly began to change. Whatever little beginnings of friendship and understanding had arisen now quickly disappeared. The town of a Saturday no longer belonged to a happy, careless crowd of black peasants, but the black folk found themselves elbowed to the gutter, while ugly quarrels flashed here and there with a quick arrest of the negroes. Colonel Cresswell made a sudden resolve. He sent for the sheriff and received him at the Oaks in his most respectable style, filling him with good food and warming him with good liquor. "Colton," he asked, "are you sending any of your white children to the nigger school yet?" "What?" yelled Colton. The colonel laughed, frankly telling Colton John Taylor's philosophy on the race problem, his willingness to let Negroes vote, his threat to let blacks and whites work together, his contempt for the officials elected by the people. "Candidly, Colton," he concluded, "I believe in aristocracy. I can't think it right or wise to replace the old aristocracy by new and untried blood." And in a sudden outburst, "But by God, sir, I'm a white man, and I place the lowest white man ever created above the highest darky ever thought of. This Yankee, Taylor, is a nigger lover. He's secretly encouraging and helping them. You saw what he did to me, and I'm warning you in time." Colton's glass dropped. "I thought it was you that was corralling the niggers against us," he exclaimed. The colonel reddened. "I don't count all white men my equals, I admit," he returned with dignity, "but I know the difference between a white man and a nigger." Colton stretched out his massive hand. "Put it there, sir," said he. "I misjudged you. Colonel Cresswell, I'm a Southerner, and I honor the old aristocracy you represent. I'm going to join with you to crush this Yankee and put the niggers in their place. They are getting impudent around here, and they need a lesson, and, by gad, they'll get one they'll remember." "Now, see here, Colton, nothing rash," the colonel charged him, warningly. "Don't stir up needless trouble. But, well, things must change." Colton rose and shook his head. "The niggers need a lesson," he muttered as he unsteadily bade his host good bye. Cresswell watched him uncomfortably as he rode away, and again a feeling of doubt stirred within him. What new force was he loosening against his black folk, his own black folk, who had lived about him and his fathers nigh 300 years? He saw the huge form of the sheriff loom like an evil spirit a moment on the rise of the road and sink into the night. He turned slowly to his cheerless house, shuddering as he entered the uninviting portals. End of chapter 36. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Chapter 37 of The Quest of the Silver Fleece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Quest of the Silver Fleece by W. E. B. Du Bois. Chapter 37. The Mob. When Emma, Bertie's child, came home after a 2 years' course of study, she had passed from girlhood to young womanhood. She was white and sandy-haired. She was not beautiful, and she appeared to be fragile, but she also looked sweet and good, with that peculiar innocence which peers out upon the world with calm, round eyes and sees no evil, but does methodically its simple everyday work. Zora mothered her. Miss Smith found her plenty to do, and Bles thought her a good girl. But Mrs. Cresswell found her perfect, and began to scheme to marry her off. For Mary Cresswell, with the restlessness and unhappiness of an unemployed woman, was trying to atone for her former blunders. Her humiliation after the episode at Cresswell Oaks had been complete. It seemed to her that the original cause of her whole life punishment lay in her persistent misunderstanding of the black people and their problem. Zora appeared to her in a new and glorified light, a vigorous, self-sacrificing woman. She knew that Zora had refused to marry Bles, and this again seemed fitting. Zora was not meant for marrying. She was a born leader, wedded to a great cause. She had long outgrown the boy and girl affection. She was the sort of woman she herself might have been if she had not married. Alwyn, on the other hand, needed a wife. He was a great, virile boy, requiring a simple, affectionate mate. No sooner did she see Emma than she was sure that this was the ideal wife. She compared herself with Helen Cresswell. Helen was a contented wife and mother because she was fitted for the position, and happy in it, while she, who had aimed so high, had fallen piteously. From such a fate she would save Zora and Bles. Emma's course in nurse training had been simple and short, and there was no resident physician, but Emma, in her unemotional way, was a born nurse and did much good among the sick in the neighborhood. Zora had a small log hospital erected, with 4 white beds, a private room, and an office, which was also Emma's bedroom. The new white physician in town, just fresh from school in Atlanta, became interested and helped with advice and suggestions. Meantime, John Taylor's troubles began to increase. Under the old political regime, it had been an easy matter to avoid serious damage suits for the accidents in the mill. Much child labor and the lack of protective devices made accidents painfully frequent. Taylor insisted that the chief cause was carelessness, while the mill hands alleged criminal neglect on his part. When the new labor officials took charge of the court, and the break occurred between Colonel Cresswell and his son-in-law, Taylor found that several damage suits were likely to cost him a considerable sum. He determined not to let the bad feelings go too far, and when a particularly distressing accident to a little girl took place, he showed more than his usual interest and offered to care for her. The new young physician recommended Zora's infirmary as the only near place that offered a chance for the child's recovery. "Take her out," Taylor promptly directed. Zora was troubled when the child came. She knew the suspicious temper of the town whites. The very next day Taylor sent out a second case, a child who had been hurt some time before and was not recovering as she should. Under the care of the little hospital and the gentle nurse, the children improved rapidly, and in 2 weeks were outdoors playing with the little black children, and even creeping into classrooms and listening. The grateful mothers came out twice a week at least, at first with suspicious aloofness, but gradually melting under Zora's tact until they sat and talked with her and told their troubles and struggles. Zora realized how human they were and how like their problems were to hers. They and their children grew to love this busy, thoughtful woman, and Zora's fears were quieted. The catastrophe came suddenly. The sheriff rode by, scowling and hunting for some poor black runaway, when he saw white children in the Negro school and white women who he knew were mill hands looking on. He was black with anger. Turning, he galloped back to town. A few hours later the young physician arrived hastily in a cab to take the women and children to town. He said something in a low tone to Zora and drove away frowning. Zora came quickly to the school and asked for Alwyn. He was in the barn and she hurried there. "Bles," she said quietly, "it is reported that a Toomsville mob will burn the school tonight." Bles stood motionless. "I've been fearing it. The sheriff has been stirring up the worst elements in the town lately, and the mills pay off tonight." "Well," she said quietly, We must prepare." He looked at her, his face aglow with admiration. "You wonder woman!" he exclaimed softly. A moment they regarded each other. She saw the love in his eyes, and he saw rising in hers something that made his heart bound. But she turned quickly away. "You must hurry, Bles. Lives are at stake." And in another moment he thundered out of the barn on the black mare. Along the pike he flew and up the plantation roads, across broad fields and back again, over to the Barton pike and along the swamp. At every cabin he whispered a word and left behind him gray faces and whispering children. His horse was reeking with sweat as he staggered again into the schoolyard, but already people were gathering, with frightened, anxious, desperate faces. Women with bundles and children, men with guns, tottering old folks, wide-eyed boys and girls. Up from the swampland came the children crying and moaning. The sun was setting. The women and children hurried into the school building, closing the doors and windows. A moment Alwyn stood without and looked back. The world was peaceful. He could hear the whistle of birds and the sobbing of the breeze in the shadowing oaks. The sky was flashing to dull and purplish blue, and over all lay the twilight hush, as though God did not care. He threw back his head and clenched his hands. His soul groaned within him. Heavenly Father, was man ever before set to such a task? Fight? God, if he could but fight! If he could but let go the elemental passions that were leaping and gathering and burning in the eyes of yonder caged and desperate black men. But his hands were tied, manacled. One desperate struggle, a whirl of blood, and the whole world would rise to crush him and his people. The white operator in yonder town had but to flash the news, Negroes killing whites, to bring all the country, all the state, all the nation to red vengeance. It mattered not what the provocation, what the desperate cause. The door suddenly opened behind him, and he wheeled around. "Zora," he whispered. "Bles," she answered softly, and they went silently in to their people. All at once, from floor to roof, the whole schoolhouse was lighted up, save a dark window here and there. Then someone slipped out into the darkness, and soon watchfire after watchfire flickered and flamed in the night, and then burned vividly, sending up sparks and black smoke. Thus, ringed with flaming silence, the school lay at the edge of the great black swamp and waited. Owls hooted in the forest. Afar, the shriek of the Montgomery train was heard across the night, mingling with the wail of a wakeful babe, and then redoubled silence. The men became restless, and Johnson began to edge away toward the lower hall. Alwyn was watching him when a faint noise came to him on the eastern breeze, a low, rumbling murmur. It died away and rose again. Then a distant gunshot woke the echoes. "They're coming!" he cried. Standing back in the shadow of a front window, he waited. Slowly, intermittently, the murmuring swelled, till it grew distinguishable as yelling, cursing, and singing, intermingled with the crash of pistol shots. Far away a flame as of a burning cabin arose, and a wilder, louder yell greeted it. Now the tramp of footsteps could be heard, and clearer and thicker the grating and booming of voices, until suddenly, far up the pike, a black moving mass, with glitter and shout, swept into view. They came headlong, guided by pine torches, which threw their white and haggard faces into wild distortion. Then, as bonfire after bonfire met their gaze, they moved slowly and more slowly, and at last sent a volley of bullets at the fires. One bullet flew high and sang through a lighted window. Without a word, Uncle Isaac sank upon the floor and lay still. Silence and renewed murmuring ensued, and the sound of high voices in dispute. Then the mass divided into two wings and slowly encircled the fence of fire, starting noisily and confidently, and then going more slowly, quietly, warily, as the silence of the flame began to tell on their heated nerves. Strained whispers arose. "Careful there!" "Go on, damn ye!" "There's someone by yon fire." "No, there ain't." "See, the bushes move." Bang! 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 "Who's that?" "It's me." "Let's rush through and fire the house." "And leave a passel of niggers behind to shoot your lights out? Not me. What the hell are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. I wish I could see a nigger. Hark!" Stealthy steps were approaching. A glint of steel flashed behind the firelights. Each band mistook the other for the armed Negroes, and the leaders yelled in vain. Human power cannot stay the dashing torrent of fear inspired human panic. Whirling, the mob fled until it struck the road in two confused, surging masses. Then, in quick frenzy, shots flew. Three men threw up their hands and tumbled limply in the dust, while the main body rushed pell-mell toward town. At early dawn, when the men relaxed from the strain of the night's vigil, Alwyn briefly counseled them. "Hide your guns." "Why?" blustered Rob. "Haven't I got a right to have a gun?" "Yes, you have, Rob, but don't be foolish. Hide it. We've not heard the last of this." But Rob tossed his head belligerently. In town, rumor spread like wildfire. A body of peaceful whites passing through the black settlement had been fired on from ambush, and 6 killed. No, 3 killed. No, 1 killed and 2 severely wounded. "This thing mustn't stop here," shouted Sheriff Colton. "These niggers must have a lesson." And before 9 next morning, fully half the grown members of the same mob, now sworn in as deputies, rode with him to search the settlement. They tramped insolently through the school grounds, but there was no shred of evidence until they came to Rob's cabin and found his gun. They tied his hands behind him and marched him toward town. But before the mob arrived the night before, Johnson, feeling that his safety lay in informing the white folks, had crawled with his gun into the swamp. In the morning he peered out as the cavalcade approached, and not knowing what had happened, he recognized Colton, the sheriff, and signaled to him cautiously. In a moment a dozen men were on him, and he appealed and explained in vain. The gun was damning evidence. The voices of Rob's wife and children could be heard behind the 2 men as they were hurried along at a dog trot. The town poured out to greet them. "The murderers! The murderers! Kill the niggers!" And they came on with a rush. The sheriff turned and disappeared in the rear. There was a great cloud of dust, a cry, and a wild scramble as the white and angry faces of men and boys gleamed for a moment and faded. 100 or more shots rang out. Then, slowly and silently, the mass of women and men were sucked into the streets of the town, leaving but black eddies on the corners to throw backward glances toward the bare, towering pine where swung 2 red and awful things. The pale boy face of one, with soft brown eyes, glared up sightless to the sun. The dead leathered bronze of the other was carved in piteous terror. End of chapter 37. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Real Medina, Texas. Chapter 38 of The Quest of the Silver Fleece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Quest of the Silver Fleece by W. E. B. Du Bois. Chapter 38. Atonement. 3 months had flown. It was spring again, and Zora sat in the transformed swamp, now a swamp in name only, beneath the great oak, dreaming. And what she dreamed there in the golden day she dared not formulate even to her own soul. She rose with a start, for there was work to do. Aunt Rachel was ill, and Emma went daily to attend her. Today, as she came back, she brought news that Colonel Cresswell, who had been unwell for several days, was worse. She must send Emma up to help, and as she started toward the school she glanced toward the Cresswell Oaks and saw the armchair of its master on the pillared porch. Colonel Cresswell sat in his chair on the porch alone. As far as he could see there was no human soul. His eyes were bloodshot, his cheeks sunken, and his breath came in painful gasps. A sort of terror shook him until he heard the distant songs of black folks in the fields. He sighed and, lying back, closed his eyes, and the breath came easier. When he opened them again a white figure was coming up the avenue of the oaks. He watched it greedily. It was Mary Cresswell, and she started when she saw him. "You are worse, father?" she asked. "Worse and better," he replied, smiling cynically. Then suddenly he announced, "I've made my will." "Why? Why?" she stammered. "Why?" sharply. "Because I'm going to die." She said nothing. He smiled and continued, "I've got it all fixed. Harry was in a tight place, gambling as usual, and I gave him a lump sum in lieu of all claims. Then I gave John Taylor, you needn't look. I sent for him. He's a damned scoundrel, but he won't lie, and I needed him. I willed his children all the rest except for 2 or 3 legacies. One was $100,000 for you." "Oh, father," she cried, "I don't deserve it." "I reckon 2 years with Harry was worth about that much," he returned grimly. "There's another gift of $200,000, and this house and plantation. Who do you think that's for?" "Helen?" "Helen," he raised his hand in threatening anger. "I might rot here for all she cares. No, no, but then I'll not tell you. Ah!" A spasm of pain shot across his face, and he lay back white and still. Abruptly he sat up again and peered down the oaks. "Hush!" he gasped. "Who's that?" "I don't know. It's a girl. I—" He gripped her till she winced. "My God, it walks like my wife, I tell you. She held her head so. Who is it?" He half rose. "Oh, father, it's nobody but Emma, little Emma, Bertie's child, the mulatto girl. She's a nurse now. I asked to have her come and attend you." "Oh," he said, "oh." He looked at the girl curiously. "Come here." He peered into her white young face. "Do you know me?" The girl shrank away from him. "Yes, sir." "What do you do?" "I teach and nurse at the school." "Good. Well, I'm going to give you some money. Do you know why?" A flash of self consciousness passed over the girl's face. She looked at him with her wide blue eyes. "Yes, grandfather," she faltered. Mrs. Cresswell rose to her feet, but the old man slowly dropped the girl's hand and lay back in his chair with lips half smiling. "Grandfather," he repeated softly. He closed his eyes a space and then opened them. A tremor shivered in his limbs as he stared darkly at the swamp. "Hark!" he cried harshly. "Do you hear the bodies creaking on the limbs? It's Rob and Johnson. I did it. I—" Suddenly he rose and stood erect. His wild eyes, stricken with death, stared full upon Emma. Slowly and thickly he spoke, working his trembling hands. "Nell, Nell, is it you, little wife, come back to accuse me? Ah, Nell, don't shrink. I know I have sinned against the light and the blood of your poor black people is red on these old hands." "No, don't put your clean white hands upon me, Nell, till I wash mine. I'll do it, Nell. I'll atone. I'm a Cresswell yet, Nell, a Cresswell and a He swayed. Vainly he struggled for the word. The shudder of death shook his soul, and he passed. A week after the funeral of Colonel Cresswell, John Taylor drove out to the school and was closeted with Miss Smith. His sister, installed once again for a few days in her old room at the school, understood that he was conferring about Emma's legacy, and she was glad. She was more and more convinced that the marriage of Emma and Bles was the best possible solution of many difficulties. She had asked Emma once if she liked Bles, and Emma had replied in her innocent way, "Oh, so much." As for Bles, he was often saying what a dear child Emma was. Neither perhaps realized yet that this was love, but it needed, Mrs. Cresswell was sure, only the lightning flash and they would know. And who could furnish that illumination better than Zora, the calm, methodical Zora who knew them so well? As for herself, once she had accomplished the marriage and paid the mortgage on the school out of her legacy, she would go abroad and in travel seek forgetfulness and healing. There had been no formal divorce, and so far as she was concerned there never would be, but the separation from her husband and America would be forever. Her brother came out of the office, nodded casually, for they had little intercourse these days, and rode away. She rushed in to Miss Smith and found her sitting there, straight, upright, composed in all save that the tears were streaming down her face and she was making no effort to stop them. "Why, Miss Smith," she faltered. Miss Smith pointed to a paper. Mrs. Cresswell picked it up curiously. It was an official notification to the trustees of the Smith School of a legacy of $200,000, together with the Cresswell house and plantation. Mrs. Cresswell sat down in open-mouthed astonishment. Twice she tried to speak, but there were so many things to say that she could not choose. "Tell Zora," Miss Smith at last managed to say. Zora was dreaming again. Somehow the old dream life with its glorious fantasies had come silently back, richer and sweeter than ever. There was no tangible reason why, and yet today she had shut herself in her den. She was searching down in the depths of her trunk, and she drew forth that filmy cloud of white, silk bordered and half finished to a gown. Why were her eyes wet today and her mind on the Silver Fleece? It was an anniversary, and perhaps she still remembered that moment, that supreme moment before the mob. She half slipped on, half wound about her, the white cloud of cloth, standing with parting lips, looking into the long mirror, and gleaming in the fading day like a midnight gowned in mist and stars. Abruptly there came a peremptory knocking at the door. "Zora, Zora," sounded Mrs. Cresswell's voice. Forgetting her informal attire, she opened the door, fearing some mishap. Mrs. Cresswell poured out the news. Zora received it in such motionless silence that Mary wondered at her want of feeling. At last, however, she said happily to Zora, "Well, the battle's over, isn't it?" "No, it's just begun." "Just begun?" echoed Mary in amazement. "Think of the servile black folk, the half awakened restless whites, the fat land waiting for the harvest, the masses panting to know. Why, the battle is scarcely even begun." "Yes, I guess that's so," Mary began to comprehend. "Well, thank God it has begun, though." "Thank God," Zora reverently repeated. "Come, let's go back to poor dear Miss Smith," suggested Mary. "I can't come just now, but pretty soon." "Why? Oh, I see, you're trying on something. How pretty and becoming. Well, hurry." As they stood together, the white woman deemed the moment opportune. She slipped her arm about the black woman's waist and began: "Zora, I've had something on my mind for a long time, and I shouldn't wonder if you had thought of the same thing." "What is it?" "Bles and Emma." "What of them?" "Their liking for each other." Zora bent a moment and caught up the folds of the fleece. "I hadn't noticed it," she said in a low voice. "Well, you're busy, you see. They've been very much together, his taking her to her charges and bringing her back and all that. I know they love each other, yet something holds them apart, afraid to show their love. Do you know, I've wondered if, quite unconsciously, it is you. You know Bles used to imagine himself in love with you, just as he did afterward with Miss Wynn." "Miss Wynn?" "Yes, the Washington girl. But he got over that and you straightened him out finally. Still, Emma probably thinks yours is the prior claim, knowing of course nothing of facts. And Bles knows she thinks of him and you, and I'm convinced if you say the word they'd love and marry." Zora walked silently with her to the door, where, looking out, she saw Bles and Emma coming from Aunt Rachel's. He was helping her from the carriage with smiling eyes, and her innocent blue eyes were fastened on him. Zora looked long and searchingly. "Please run and tell them of the legacy," she begged. I will come in a moment." And Mrs. Cresswell hurried out. Zora turned back steadily to her room and locked herself in. After all, why shouldn't it be? Why had it not occurred to her before in her blindness? If she had wanted him, and ah, God, was not all her life simply the want of him? Why had she not bound him to her when he had offered himself? Why had she not bound him to her? She knew as she asked, because she had wanted all, not a part, everything, love, respect, and perfect faith. Not one thing could she spare then, not one thing. And now, oh God, she had dreamed that it was all hers, since that night of death and circling flame when they looked at each other soul to soul. But he had not meant anything. It was pity she had seen there, not love, and she rose and walked the room slowly, fast and faster. With trembling hands she drew the Silver Fleece around her. Her head swam again, and the blood flashed in her eyes. She heard a calling in the swamp, and the shadow of Elspeth seemed to hover over her, claiming her for her own, dragging her down, down. She rushed through the swamp. The lagoon lay there before her presently, gleaming in the darkness, cold and still, and in it swam an awful shape. She held her burning head. Was not everything plain? Was not everything clear? This was sacrifice. This was the atonement for the unforgiven sin. Emma's was the pure soul which she must offer up to God, for it was God, a cold and mighty God, who had given it to Bles, her Bles. It was well. God willed it. But could she live? Must she live? Did God ask that too? All at once she stood straight. Her whole body grew tense, alert. She heard no sound behind her, but knew he was there, and braced herself. She must be true. She must be just. She must pay the utmost farthing. "Bles," she called faintly, but did not turn her head. "Zora." "Bles," she choked, but her voice came stronger. "I know all. Emma is a good girl. I helped bring her up myself and did all I could for her, and she is pure. Marry her." His voice came slow and firm. "Emma? I don't love Emma. I love someone else." Her heart bounded and again was still. It was that Washington girl then. She answered dully, groping for words, for she was tired. "Who is it?" The best woman in all the world, Zora." "And is," she struggled at the word madly, "is she pure?" "She is more than pure." "Then you must marry her, Bles." "I am not worthy of her," he answered, sinking before her. Then at last illumination dawned upon her blindness. She stood very still and lifted up her eyes. The swamp was living, vibrant, tremulous. There where the first long note of night lay shot with burning crimson, burst in sudden radiance the wide beauty of the moon. There pulsed a glory in the air. Her little hands groped and wandered over his close curled hair, and she sobbed, deep voiced: "Will you marry me, Bles?" L'Envoi. Lend me thy ears, O God, the reader, whose father aforetime sent mine down into the land of Egypt, into this house of bondage. Lay not these words aside for a moment's fantasy, but lift up thine eyes upon the horror in this land, the maiming and mocking and murdering of my people, and the prisonment of their souls. Let my people go, O Infinite One, lest the world shudder at. End of chapter 38. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Quest of the Silver Fleece by W. E. B. Du Bois.